All right. Hi, this is Tessa Keogh, and this is the Society for One Place Studies May Hangout. And this month, Alex Coles is going to be filling us in a little bit on the status of a shared endeavor, which is the project that we're working on this year, and then also introduce us to our special guest. So, Alex, why don't you take it away?
Okay, hi everyone. For those of you who are new to us, the Society for One Place Studies is devoted to encouraging the study of a particular place and all the people that have lived in that place over time. So it is a mix of family history and local history. We find it quite addictive. That place could be quite small, a small hamlet, or a large town, and it can be anywhere in the world. We've got members that are all over the world, and they're not necessarily studying places that are in the region that they live. Each year, the Society suggests a project that our members might like to take part in, which we call a shared endeavour. Generally, that's looking at a particular topic so that we're all studying the same topic and seeing how it applies to our individual places that we're studying. This year, as Tessa said, our shared endeavour is focused on World War One. There's a lot of attention in the media and in family history circles on World War One this year, as it is the 100-year centenary of the start of the war. I think this is particularly true for those in the UK, but perhaps not so much for those in the US. Would that be right, Tessa? Right at the moment?
Yes, yes, it
It'll
would.
kick
I
in a
think we
few.
come in a little later.
Yeah, so when that happens, no doubt you'll be swamped with media coverage as the rest of us have been. Um, just this month, we've seen initiatives like the Lives of the First World War website, which finally launched. That's out from the Imperial War Museum in the UK, who have partnered with DC Thompson, who used to be Bright Solid, and they're behind the Find My Past website. And the aim of that website, the new Lives of the First World War website, is to create a digital everyone that served in the war. It brings together their military records, biographical records, any personal recollections and stories that people have of their servicemen that they'd like to share in order to create a life story for each of those servicemen. It's a great aim. It is fair to say we've seen a bit of criticism within the family history community and the One Place Studies community. There's features that they're still working on that haven't been released yet, features that could be improved. But they are doing a good job of listening to feedback and making sure there's lots of mechanisms to get feedback and try and improve and develop that site so it achieves its aims. Turning back to specifically One Place Studies and World War One, the bare minimum that we'd be trying to achieve is to identify any fallen servicemen from our place and create a brief profile of those men or women. So similar to the life stories on Lives of the First World War. But we're One Place Studies, we can never stop there. Bare minimum is never good enough for us. So we want to learn more. The Society's come up with a whole pile of ideas and areas that we could look at within that topic. We have an area on our members forum that's devoted to it, so we can discuss what we're up to, what we're discovering, hints and tips in using particular databases and websites. We have articles in our quarterly journal Destinations, and we're having several hangouts here on Google Plus during the year chatting about the project, and just like today's session. So we are particularly interested in the impact of World War One on the communities that we study. And that's obviously more than knowing just who served. It's learning about service experiences were, how it affected them, and how the war affected the place those servicemen were from. So who was left behind, how did life change during the war, how were families affected, whether that was because of men who were killed or men who were just away for the duration of the war, and how things inevitably changed after the war. So one big aspect of this is how servicemen were mentally and emotionally affected by their experiences. Now, I haven't served in the military, I haven't been in a war zone. I'm sure you can never really understand that fully without having experienced it, but we're going to try. Today we have a special guest with us. So Susie Grogan is a writer and family historian with a particular specialisation in mental health issues. She has a book coming out in a few months entitled Shell-Shocked Britain, the First World War's Legacy for Britain's Mental Health. Welcome to the Hangout, Susie.
Thank you for having me.
We are delighted you are here. To kick off, would you like to tell us a little bit about how the book came about?
Well, interestingly, it was very definitely a family history project, and I had found out from my mum. I have a cousin, and we probably all have cousins, who enjoy family history to such an extent that they look at every level of your family tree, and I only had one branch left that hadn't been researched, and my mum said that it was her maternal side that was somewhat mysterious. So I looked into it, and in all my researches, I came across a newspaper cutting in the Times. I found, since I started this project, the value of newspaper reports, and it mentioned her uncle Alfred, who she said they were always talking about in hushed tones, and saying it was the war that did it, because he died. So there was an assumption that he'd served at the front. Well, when I saw this cutting, it was clear he hadn't served at the front. Well, he certainly hadn't died at the front. In 1922, he, in the front room of 49 Hornsey Rise, where my mum actually remembers regularly visiting as a child, he cut the throat of his girlfriend and then cut his own throat in front, it turns out, of my grandmother, who had never mentioned it to my mum at all. My mum knew nothing about it, obviously. I blazed in with this fascinating story, quite forgetting that it was her uncle and her mother and everybody who had been involved. But actually she was fascinated, mercifully. And I thought, well, there's the story behind this. Her family are gentle, mild souls. A little bit more detail, and it turned out that in 1917 he had been involved in one of the first Blitz air raids on London, and I knew very little about them. I thought the Blitz started in the Second World War. But there were terrible air raids on London and the East and Midlands of Britain during the First World War, and my great uncle was involved in one. And he suffered air raid shock and was in hospital for a year. We haven't identified the hospital, sadly, but he was in hospital for a year and then discharged with something on his service record that was detailed as enuresis, which I don't know how much you know about that, but basically he'd become incontinent at the age of 30. And the newspaper reports that I then went and looked at in more detail, the local ones, clearly he had changed since his experiences in the war. And I thought that, you know, the bald facts of a newspaper report never really discuss the whole picture. And I don't know, I'm not the only one, I'm sure, who thought that actually the home front was kept one removed from the war in the First World War in a way that they weren't in the Second. But all my researchers then showed that actually Britain as a whole had experienced trauma during that First World War, and I thought, I want to find out more. I want to find out the backstory and why my great uncle might have suffered in that way and how many others suffered like him.
Yeah, so the home front. Yeah, the home front, that's the same impression that I had got. When you think home front, you think World War II, and from the little bit that I've read so far, it seems like it was very, very similar in World War I, which surprised me.
Yeah, it did me too, and I think most people that I've spoken to had no concept of what certain communities, and some communities were absolutely devastated, others barely touched, but most communities were affected by the Great War in ways that had an impact on into the Second. You know, the fact that they'd lost a whole generation of their young people. Some villages had lost every member of their, you know, the 18 to 30 age group young males. So, you know, it was a devastating blow, and if it happened today, although we never ever should, you know, impose 21st century values on our ancestors, they're only it's only 100 years ago. They're our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our great-uncles. They're not that far removed from us, and their responses would have been very similar. You know, if it happened to us today, we'd all be literally, well, blown away.
Well, and the interesting thing is, today when things happen,
anyway, so that's
people
why
are today when things happen, people are also really involved in, I would say, memorials. You know, they just kind of crop up here, at least in the United States, when some tragedy occurs. But I do think, you know, earlier on, people kind of kept it to themselves. I'm wondering if it was also a different kind of a war. Is that something you've found? Was, you know, the way that people were fighting, or what was used, did this have a real difference than, say, earlier wars?
Yes, I mean, that's what I was going to discuss. I don't know if you want me to just go through it, the things I was going to discuss as a short presentation, and then you can fire questions at me. But certainly it was a very different kind of war. It was the first truly mechanized war. They called it total war, but really, I think there'd been one previously in about 1906. It was involved Russia, and that was the first trench warfare. But this was very definitely the first warfare where people were put in situations where simply they couldn't move. For months on end, there would be very little action, or periods of bombardment and then very little action, and they would be literally on edge the whole time. And it was the first time that there had been so little action. For, you know, people would run towards the enemy in previous wars. They'd have their bayonets out, they'd have rifles, they'd be charging on cavalry. And at the start of the First World War, that's what British generals anticipated again. But of course, German engineering had come up with some far, far greater weapons than a horse and a man and a sword. So yes, it was a terrible shock, certainly to the regular soldiers who were anticipating a completely different kind of war, and then obviously went on for an awful lot longer than anybody was anticipating. So yes, that was one of the reasons, and certainly after the war, that was one of the reasons that they were searching for reasons, I suppose, but that was one of those that was a proven reason. You know, it was definitely, there's only so much in our own mental banks, and those men generally went overdrawn, and then they couldn't fight anymore. It was as simple as that.
Mm.
Did you want me to? I don't quite know how you want me to proceed.
With your slides now, and we'll see how that goes.
Yeah. Now, I don't know what you can see on the screen.
Well, right now we're seeing you, and you're going to go ahead and do your screen share, and we'll see if the magic works.
There we go. Can you see it?
Not yet. Oh, now it's up. Great.
You can see it. Can you see it?
I'm seeing you again. No, I'm seeing you again. It was up for a minute.
That's me being inept. You must excuse me for a moment.
And this is one of those things that happens even though you practice. Okay, we are back to Shell Shocked, the cover.
Yeah. Have you got it now?
No, we had it for a minute, and then it comes back to you. What you need?
Sorry, it's me being.
That's okay.
I don't think I'm actually doing anything, and I'm making it go away.
All right.
Talking.
You can just talk.
Just over that slide.
I'll find a way of organising this. I mean, what I wanted to say was, and I'm going to go and find some pictures, and I will show things as I go through. But certainly, the war itself was one of the the way that the war was fought was very definitely one of the key things that caused shell shock. And what I thought I'd do to start with, tell me if you're not seeing me, because I'm very conscious of the fact I'm flicking through screens madly here, is that there was a history of conditions that could have been called shell shock, that if only the medical men had made the links, people would have been well aware of the dangers before the war even started. All through history, even the Greeks had detailed something that was very akin to shell shock. The fact that people would start behaving in an irrational way in the middle of battles. It certainly happened in the Crimea, it happened in the American Civil War. And men were called, it was called soldier's heart, and it was put down to carrying heavy backpacks. And, you know, generally speaking, it was simply that the men suffered the palpitations, the feeling of nervousness, the symptoms of anxiety as we would recognise it today. But at the time, they put it down to other things. I don't think they ever really recognised it as a condition, but it had been something that had been experienced by soldiers for at least 2,000 years, and Shakespeare mentions it actually. And I've got a great quote in my book from Henry IV, and it actually describes shell shock brilliantly. It's you know, that feeling of it's Kate, and she's just describing her husband sleeping at night, waking up or not waking up fully, and he's reliving battles and the loss of comrades, and the nightmares were with him even then. So clearly it's not something that couldn't have been anticipated had medical men chosen or been organised enough, I think is probably fairer to say. It wasn't a priority. Female mental health was very much the priority before the Great War. Women were hysterical, men didn't break down. Basically what happened, even with the suffragettes, you know, there was discussions about how every woman over the age of 40 ought to be put in an asylum. As soon as she hit the menopause, she would go hysterical and was... and those were the symptoms that men started experiencing on the front from 1914 onwards. It was the first, when it was the retreat at Mons, and the very first battles of the First World War, when the stalemate became obvious. And generally, you know, these people were regular soldiers. They were well-trained soldiers. These people, if you go back in family history, you know, those men that you know were army men through and through. Even those men were finding it impossible to carry on during those periods. So, yes, as we talked before, the mechanisation, the bombardment, the artillery fire was shocking, and literally the first thing that they attributed shell shock to was percussive rather than concussive. I don't know if the terms are. Basically, they thought that proximity to a shell going off caused shell shock. So it would have rattled their brains. It would have sent them slightly mad. It would have created some of those symptoms of deafness, inability to function, was actually something physical. And many doctors through the war thought it was something physical rather than something psychological. And it was only gradually, and as psychiatry developed over the period and afterwards, that they realised there was something far more not neurological but psychological going on.
And Susie, one quick question. Do you think a part of that is because we would much prefer to have something be a physical ailment than we would to have it be an emotional ailment or a mental health aspect to it? Some of the items that I was reading, I think it's Dr. Myers, was really looking into it at the time, but other people didn't want to go there at all, you know, because if you said that some people couldn't handle this emotionally, you know, you either didn't want that stigma or else you didn't want people thinking that they had an emotional component to it.
Well, interesting. Charles Myers is credited with first coining the term shell shock, although he never claimed to have done so. But he wrote an article for The Lancet in 1915 where he mentioned the term shell shock. And it struck a chord with those troops, the regular troops, and with, you know, the ranks who wanted a term to explain how they were feeling. And actually doctors didn't really like it very much. It's not one of those terms that describes anything in any detail, certainly not from a medical perspective. It really didn't describe what was happening. But men who felt that they were being ignored and were being treated with less respect than their physically wounded comrades felt that they had a term to describe something that had been caused by the war. And that's what happened in the papers. They picked up on it back at home as well. They picked up on the term shell shock as a way to describe so many men who were already being returned back to Britain exhibiting these symptoms. So yes, it was very definitely something that, you know, there was a stigma. And even, I mean, going a little bit off the topic, but away and after the war, even then they were treated with, well, it's a horrible story really, because a wounded man who'd lost his leg would be treated in one way. A man who was shell-shocked and whose life had been devastated and had no hope of recovery would have a lower pension. His pension would be reduced. His widow would have far less to live on because the costs of his care, for example, were taken out of the pension, where a physically wounded man's costs weren't. So, you know, there is that ongoing stigma, which, although it isn't, you're not injured, it was in other ways those men were left to feel very much second class in terms of the wounds they'd incurred. So yes, it was very definitely. Charles Myers was one of those great men who worked tirelessly at the front, actually, to support psychologically affected men. He'd noticed and was concerned about the numbers, and he actually volunteered. He wasn't somebody who was a psychiatrist or a well-known doctor in the field. He was just a man committed to finding out what shell shock was and to try and help these men. He actually throughout the war was going backwards and forwards between the front and the home front, because they realised quite quickly, I don't know if you've heard, I don't know if it's a term that's used elsewhere, but it's PIE, which is proximity, and basically what they wanted to do was to make sure men didn't think that going off with shell shock was a way to get out of the war. And they did find that men recovered who were only mildly shell shocked, recovered better and were fit for, because basically they wanted them back in the trenches, were fit for duty again more quickly if they stayed close to the line. If they were sent home, they were very much less likely to come back again, and very much more likely to end the war in an asylum than if they stayed close to the front, close to their comrades, part of the whole war, basically still part of the battle. The men, given the chance to rest and recuperate, were actually much more likely to go back into the battle. Maybe again to relapse. If they did, they were very unlikely to go back again. But certainly that's what Charles Myers and a lot of other psychologists were working on, the basis of keeping men as close to the front as possible and only sending them back behind the lines as a very last resort. So yes, he was a great man. I mean, there's so many great doctors, shell shock doctors during the war. There was William Rivers, who I suspect, if you've ever read the Regeneration trilogy by Pat Barker, or seen the film Regeneration, which I would really recommend. He was at Craiglockhart in Scotland. But again, we see so many of these pictures, and actually the men that are being treated are officers, and officers were treated in a very different way to those who were serving under them. If you have the story of an officer, officers were actually much more likely to be killed, relatively speaking, to the men underneath them. Subalterns, young officers, were much more likely to be killed. You know, there was the average life expectancy of a young officer at one point during the war was about 3 weeks. Because
do you know what the reason for that is? Or is there any hypothesis?
Well, yeah, they led their men over the front. Okay. They were the first to go over the top. So, and they had the responsibility for these men under them. And for them, you see, they were brought up in the public school system, very much, what's the word, you know, sort of the heroic ideal, and, you know, be a good sport and stiff upper lip and all that. It was genuine. That was the way public school boys were encouraged to think of themselves. they were almost taking a paternal role with the Arab troops. So the responsibility was huge, and they had to lead from the front.
All right.
So yes,
One quick question, Susie. When you mentioned public school, that means something probably very different in the United States.
Yeah. Private school.
Is that the equivalent of private school in kind of a noble?
I never quite got to grips with that in Britain, but yeah, private school. It just goes to show that actually. Yes, private school. Yes, those were the young men from the families, the very well-to-do families, the aristocracy. They were proportionately, they lost, you know, a vast number of what would be expected to have been the upcoming government officials, the people who were going to enter parliament, the lawyers, all those people that would have been anticipated as going into leading the empire after the war. Proportionately, they were much more likely to die than...
Now, you said that they were treated differently than what we would call the enlisted men, but maybe that's a different term in Britain as well. So the foot soldiers, I'd call it, versus how were they treated differently with shell shock?
Well, for starters, they never used the term shell shock, really, or rarely used the term shell shock for officers. They were much more likely to be termed neurasthenic, which was, well, you say neurasthenic, they exhibited symptoms of depression, of what they called melancholy. They rarely exhibited the hysterical symptoms, which you see in the films. And if I can show you my presentation at some point, there is a link in there that shows a brief YouTube clip. They didn't show the symptoms that you see on old films of the jerky movements, the inability to speak, the deafness, the tics. Men exhibited facial tics, or they repeated movements. I think one man had bayoneted a German man in the stomach, and he exhibited a tic that resembled the movement. And those were seen to be the foot soldiers. The officers were very much more likely to be in deep depressions and sent home for a rest cure. So they were sent home to probably warm baths, milky diets, rest and recuperation in nice country houses, whereas the other soldiers were treated quite differently. And you know, that there's a huge gap actually between how they were treated, and actually in the trenches men had to suffer the same privations. Officers and their men were suffering similar privations. They were living with the same rats and with the same dead bodies and the same mud, yet get them out of there and the old class barriers came straight back up again. And certainly the stigma was very much more apparent with those men who had shell shock, who were trying to go back to lead and what you'd put in inverted commas an ordinary family life rather than a privileged one. So yes, another reason for the stigma was the class barriers were significant. So yes, but you know, I think that there was such a huge risk and a huge responsibility on those young men's shoulders. They were 18, 19, 20. The young officers were looking after men who could often be a decade older than themselves and taking on what was almost a maternal role, because they'd be making sure that their men were okay and making sure they were fed, helping them read their letters. They all became, you know, that's why they suffered these deep depressions. I think they came to the conclusion was because, you know, they knew their men, and suddenly they could turn round and find one had been blown to smithereens behind them. It's something that we can't, sitting here, understand, even begin to understand how that must have felt to somebody who'd come from a quiet, leafy British parish and been thrust into that kind of environment. So, yes, I think that was very definitely a different way of responding.
Susie, I'm curious too about this difference in treatment. I've been studying a soldier who was a young lieutenant and went and fought on the Somme, and when the battle settled down, they returned from the battlefield. I think he'd lost a great deal of his men, and he just walked past his fellow officers and then went and shot himself.
Yeah.
Now, he was accorded full honors, and he's on the Commonwealth War Graves website. So he got his medals and everything because he fought bravely. But I just wondered if you'd seen similar or different treatment with the enlisted fellows.
Yeah, it often goes back to that point about whether people were thought to be cowards, and the need to keep military discipline. That's an interesting story because others weren't so fortunate to be accorded any kind of honours at all in that sort of situation. And I had my grandfather fought very bravely, and he'd been gassed, and he was a stretcher bearer, and a shell hit one end of the stretcher with the wounded man on it and my grandfather's comrade and blew them to smithereens. My grandfather ran away and hid in a hole, as one would, I think, under those circumstances. And he was court-martialed for deserting his post, which, mercifully, he wasn't found guilty. I think somebody saw literally the madness in that. But the soldiers, the officers themselves, I mean, I think very few of them were cowards. It was very quickly realised if an officer was losing it, you know, the discipline of the whole battalion could be put at risk if one officer was losing it. But yes, there's lots of stories about people deciding that they simply can't go on. I tell a story in the book about one man who he described it after the war, he didn't know why it happened. Again, he was an officer, but he'd been under fire and it had been just one moment too many. And he lay down by the side of the road, he describes it, and curled up in a ball and just wanted someone to take it all away. And he described it as being like a child again, wanting actually to go back to being a child and for someone just to lift all that responsibility off their shoulders. And that's how the officers felt. It was such a responsibility that they collapsed under the strain of that rather than the bombardment. It was the responsibility, and I think that's how the psychiatrists saw it often, was you know, the strength of the battalion rested on the shoulders of the young officers. The troops under them were, you know, the thing is, we don't know how many of them shot themselves. The suicide statistics haven't been kept. You can look at suicide statistics, which I've researched in quite a lot of depth to see whether on the home front suicides went up and what happened during and after the war. But the suicide statistics don't include those in the armed forces, and there's no way we can find out how many of the ordinary soldiers took their own lives. But lots of them did. We know they did. So it's lovely to find these stories. It's terribly difficult. It's terribly difficult to dig out the stories of the ordinary soldiers, because we do rely a lot on the history that's offered to us by the officer classes. During and after the war, most of the writing was done by the officer class, whether they be poets or whether they just be correspondents. Most of them were for the educated officer class. So it's difficult to. Am I wandering a bit? You must pull me back.
No.
I do have a question for you, Susie.
Yeah.
How much would the community have known about shell shock? I think you mentioned before it was being talked about a bit in the newspapers. Was it just something they were exposed to if a man came back home suffering shell shock and then they sort of got to see it at first hand, or?
A lot of them didn't understand it at all. I mean, it is, we can look at local papers, and yes, it's mentioned in local papers, but if you're talking about a small local community, they would see it firsthand if someone came back having experienced it, because there wasn't the media coverage that we have now. Literally all they had was the papers, and ultimately, and certainly once they realised that the war wasn't going to be over by Christmas, a lot of it was censored. And when they sent letters home, even those soldiers who were quite traumatised did their very best to keep that from those people they were sending letters home to. They were all, you know, it's all fine here, we're being well fed, and I've got a nice pair of boots. When really what they were actually suffering was deprivation, sleep deprivation, really, really poor diets. And they were having an utterly miserable time of it. But a lot of it, when you read their letters, they're all, you know, sort of upbeat, when you know they can't possibly have felt like that. So a lot of people at home would have been unaware until they were literally faced with it. But they were.
And then was there sympathy and understanding, do you think, for the situation, or was it more of a stigma?
I don't think we can generalise. I think it'd be very difficult to generalise. Certainly in the medical establishment, there was, what's the word, suspicion, I think. There's some people looked on people as malingerers until proven otherwise. Other people looked at them with a lot more empathy. Any young man, the trouble was, by a certain part of the war, they wanted anybody who looked fit and healthy to join up, even if they were utterly incapable of coping in that situation. They had less training, and actually they were probably the less suitable for fighting. They hadn't volunteered because they probably realised that they'd be rubbish at it, to be frank. Others were simply trying to get out of it, and I think people in Britain didn't have a lot of sympathy with a young man in civvies who looked like they ought to be at the front. So if you came home and you didn't have an obvious wound, you were likely to face, I would have said, quite a lot of discrimination. At one point, women gave out white feathers, so there were, I don't know if you heard about that, as the women who gave out white feathers. There was a movement, and even the suffragette movement. I mean, the suffragette movement didn't talk. They were very keen. The Pankhursts, Emmeline Pankhurst, was very keen to get men out to the front. So there was a lot of pressure from the women. There's great posters of women in Britain say go. What have you done? Why? There was a huge amount of pressure on a young person, and if you came home and you weren't obviously injured, there wasn't going to be an awful lot of sympathy for you, and except from your closest family, I should think.
And one thing I would point out is, and I know we've had it in a few of the newsletters, is the posters. And if you look through, is it the Imperial War Museum has the posters from World War I? You can go to the website and take a look at them. But when I was clicking through them recently, there are a lot that clearly are calling people out if they're not, what are you going to tell your children if you didn't serve? Or, people pointing at somebody walking down the street saying, why isn't he in uniform? And yeah, I thought it was a lot of propaganda about getting bodies over there.
Can I, if it's all right with you, if I can just sort of hunt out a picture that I'd quite like to show you now that you've mentioned that. Can you bear with me while I find it?
Sure.
And I'll see if I can make this one work, even if I can't make the presentation work properly. There were some wonderful postcards that were, some of them I cannot work out who they'd have been sent by, because they're simply quite, nauseating, I think would probably be the words I would use. But let me see here. There we go. Here's one. Now I'm going to try the screen. When I've got this up on my screen, I'm going to try the capture thing again. Screen
share.
Screen share thingy. Let's see if I can make that work. Oh, come on, where are you? I really am quite rubbish at this. I do apologise. There, it's up on my screen, but it's not up on. I can get it to work. There were a lot of postcards, and they were, it's really frustrating this for me, because I know I can see it on my, there we go. Hang on, can you see that?
Not yet, but I'm going to, okay, there we've got it. What did you do in the Great War? Excellent.
Have you got these pictures?
Yes.
Yeah? You have?
Excellent.
Hurrah, it's working. This is amazing.
Now you're flying through them very quickly.
I'm trying to work backwards.
Okay, great.
So close your eyes for a minute while I find the one I was particularly trying to find. There was, there we go. What did you do in the Great War, Daddy? what did I do when they called for men? I was ready then to go and fight the foe. I did my best for king and country, laddie, just to keep old Britain free. But when I'm old and grey, for what I've done today, what will Britain do for me? There were lots of postcards like this that were, you know, basically, if you can see that one, oops, oh, it flicks by too quickly. These postcards were sent from the front and to the front, I think. Oh, see, look, I beg your pardon.
That's okay. Do you have it on presentation mode as opposed to...
Do I?
Right. You know, because you should be able to just kind of click through one at a time. But this is, oh, this is a terrible photo. This is a skull. Okay.
Shall I minimize that again? I'll work that one out. I'm so sorry about this. Yes,
that's not a problem. As we go through and we practice these things, then the day shows up and we have a little trouble. But what I did notice was, you know, they're definitely making a point. They're showing people with missing limbs. They have, they got very,
oh, the one with
I would say crass near the end when they were looking for people.
The worst thing is that was after the war. I think the one with a missing limb. I'm doing this all the wrong way round. A better half a loaf than no bread. That was what it said at the bottom of the postcard. Basically, that was women after the war, and that was those women who felt that they, basically, the lost generation of men was supposed to have left a generation of women who couldn't find husbands. It's not strictly true. It's very definitely. You know, if you've got in your family trees and spinsters, that you may find that your family tree was more middle class than working class women who were quite keen to find husbands again after the war. But that, yes, that they were quite crass, and they were, some of them, you know, there were pictures of women with Jesus over their shoulder, and basically were fighting for king and country and God. I mean, it was literally, we thought we had God on our side. So yes, there was a lot of that kind of imagery that was going to put pressure on people, and the church put pressure on people. You know, they were recruiting from the pulpit. So you know, there was a disengagement with religion in the end as well, because they were recruiting from the pulpit. So there was pressure from every angle, I think, to get out there and do your bit. So by the end of the war, the generals were complaining that their armies were being made up of people who should have been in prison, should have been in mental hospitals, basically the generals were not impressed with the conscripts that were coming to them by the end of the war. So yes, there was pressure to get everybody out there, whatever their level of fitness. So it's not surprising men broke down. I mean, really, they weren't fitted for the life at all.
Now, after the war, how did people move forward from a diagnosis of shell shock, or a diagnosis of, you know, and it wasn't a diagnosis, but, you know, that person was a coward, or that person, you know, left or couldn't handle it. How, if at all, did it follow you later? Well, if you had been a soldier.
That I can't get this presentation to work just as we'd managed beforehand, because what I wanted to talk about a bit was about the treatments that people had, because when they came back from the front, if that initial period of rest and recuperation behind the lines didn't work and they had to come home and they were sent to a hospital, it was quite random, actually, the hospitals that they were sent back to. They may not have been a hospital that was anywhere near their home, and it may have been a hospital that wasn't suited to treating psychiatric cases at all. But later on, they realised that they needed wards separate from physically wounded men. But still, it depended which hospital you went back to, the treatment that you got. So, for example, there's famous hospitals. There's the Maudsley Hospital in London, which was run by Frederick Mott, who is a very famous doctor, and he was treating people very much from a neurological and physiological perspective. So he felt it was much more to do with the body. So get you out in the nice open air, give you a rest, give you a good diet, give you warm baths, make you feel that you were able to recharge your batteries, really. He didn't look at the reasons why you might have broken down in the first place. He just wanted to get people better again. And then there was Lewis Yelland he was at Queen Square, and he was much more scary because he was very keen on Faradization. And I don't know if anybody has heard of Faradization, but it was the electric shock treatment that they experimented on young men on the war. And he was generally sent the regular troops. He didn't treat officers. And basically it was a young man who couldn't speak, perhaps was paralyzed, and he'd actually apply electrodes to the parts of their body that were experiencing the symptoms. And he kept doing it and increasing the electrical current until they stopped exhibiting the symptoms. If they couldn't speak, he gave electric shocks until they could. If they couldn't move their hand, he gave an electric shock until their hand moved. And he worked with other doctors who took a very military approach to it and basically told the men they were going to get better. All you need to do is to be told that you're going to get better. And it was very much, if you look at pictures of it, it looks terribly cruel, and it was terribly cruel.
I was gonna take that next step. It is cruel.
He sounds like a monster. He actually had, in his own mind, a good reason for doing it, but he sounds like a complete monster. And if you watch the film Regeneration, you'll get an idea, because it's actually portrayed in that film. Lewis Yelland's in that film, and he wasn't quite such a monster as he appears in the film, because he's been a bit Hollywoodized, but he certainly was a man that you wouldn't like to trust your nearest and dearest to. And as a contrast, if you ended up in Maghull Military Hospital, you'd be treated by people like William Rivers, who were interested in the psychology of it. So they'd try and assess why you'd broken down in the first place, whether you were somebody who had a family history of mental illness, if you had an experience as a child that may have, made it difficult for you to deal with close confinement. They'd do the talking treatments. It was a completely different regime, and they had a lot of success. Obviously, they took a completely different approach. But again, although by the end of the war people were learning from those psychiatrists, still it very much depended on the hospital you were sent to. You may end up at Seal Hain down in Devon with Arthur Hurst, who, if you do watch the Pathé films on YouTube, he was the one who organised the filming of these men with shell shock. And actually he was something of a fraud, because now you'd have to put reconstruction along the bottom. We watch them as if this is the truth, but if you see these pictures of shell shock men, the films of shell shock men, it's almost inevitable that some of them are reconstructions, and he's asked the men to repeat and play act out how they felt. And he, by the end of the war, said that he could cure somebody in 10 minutes. But what actually, if you look underneath that, was that by the end of the war they were telling people they weren't going back to the front. And the best way to get a man to get better, they said, was to tell him he didn't have to go back to the front. So it's really complex, and it really depended on the hospital and the doctor that you ended up with during that war period. It was, talk about postcode lottery nowadays, but really it was as simple as that. It depended on the doctor who treated you. So,
Susie,
yeah.
I saw, I think in one of your charts that flipped by rather quickly, something about suicides. Now, I think you used a term earlier in your presentation, neurasthenia or something like that.
Neurasthenia?
Yeah. And
yeah.
I just saw that a couple weeks ago on a sailor's record I was looking at.
Right.
And he was an enlisted fellow. He'd been in the Royal Navy for some years at that time, but I think this was about 1917, and he was medically discharged with that. And I looked it up, and it said something about nerves. And I just wondered, because it was not that many years later that he died. He died young, and I haven't gotten his death certificate yet, but I thought I'd really be interested to see the cause of death there, and I just wondered if you had some information on how many of these people, you know, became suicide victims later, or could, or you can tell anything about that.
It's interesting because the post-war suicide figures are very interesting. I'm scared to even touch my computer now in case I send this off on a tangent. I hope there's a way we can get them to you afterwards. Can we link to things afterwards and add it to it?
Yes, Susie, we can go ahead and link to the presentation, link to the YouTube videos, any of that. Yeah. So.
Oh, good. Well, that's a relief, because actually, you know, the figures after the war rocketed. The suicide figures rocketed, but they don't it doesn't go up in the age groups you would suspect, because you'd think that maybe it was young men coming back from the war. A lot of the suicides were in the age group that were the parents you would anticipate of those who came back from the war. There's a difference as well in the way people kill themselves. I mean, there's lots of newspaper reports. Young men did come back. They found work difficult. I found a really tragic headline: a suicide of young man who found work irksome. Well, I mean, actually, when you read the report, he was a brave soldier in the war. He'd come back neurasthenic. He'd gone to work in an office and simply couldn't deal with it, and walked out and walked in front of a train. Well, that kind of headline really quite disguises a small tragedy there, and there were numerous of them. But the methods that rocketed after the war were things like gassing and using coal gas, because that became more frequent. People had gas ovens and people had cars, and it's almost impossible to tell who it is who is finding life almost impossible to deal with, but they seem to be in an older age bracket, and they're not shooting themselves. They're cutting their throats, they're hanging themselves, they're walking in front of trains, they're murdering their families and then killing themselves. There's so many tragic stories post-war, and you really have to hunt through the newspaper reports or to find an individual service record and try and hunt that way, because the suicide figures just don't tell the whole story. It's almost impossible. As female suicides go up, so mothers found it very difficult to deal with. I found women who committed suicide because they were terrified of the air raids, for example. Women were absolutely petrified about their children and the dangers their children faced, even being out of their sight, and it just took its toll. So whereas during the war suicide levels were actually going down because the war spirit kind of bolstered everybody, I suppose, post-war, there was a rise in suicides. And of course the figures, you know, they don't have a story behind them. We can only draw inferences from it, but the newspaper reports are far more useful in that respect. So yes, you may find when you see the death certificate that men came back and shot themselves or killed themselves 6 years afterwards, 10 years afterwards. They, even towards the beginning of the Second World War, there were still men who were breaking down in the 1930s due to their war experiences in the First World War. So you can't take anything for granted. I mean, obviously, if you see somebody who served in the First World War and died at the age of 45, you know, it is worth delving that little bit deeper to see whether maybe it was their war service that had taken its toll. It weakened so many men, not only physically but mentally. So yeah, it's definitely worth.
And I think something else that's interesting on that is a lot of times, certainly depending on the community you live in, or you know who the medical examiner is, things that are accidents were really suicides. But certainly for Catholics, you know, if you couldn't be buried in the hallowed ground, so to speak, if it was a suicide, it was very common to say that things were accidents. And so when you're looking at it, you're thinking, how is that considered an accident? Well, it was the better form. And so you have suicides that you find, but you're also going to have a number that you don't catch because they come up as something else. So that's kind of...
And they do say suicide while, you know, whilst of unsound mind. So, you know, they take the, they basically suggest that they're not in their right mind when they consider suicide. It's not a rational act, it's something utterly irrational. So, yes, I dare say very many of them were covered up, certainly by the families of the younger men in the. If it didn't make the press, then nobody would have known about it. So, yes, it's definitely worth finding out a little bit more about that one. You can't take anything for granted with these stories. I certainly found out that with my Uncle Alf. You know, you make an assumption.
In that regard, you know, your family had kept that on the down low, we would say, are very quiet, and you kind of ran into it, you know, and looked it up. And, you know, what it's kind of interesting, you decided to put it all out there because you have this in your book. You decided to look at the big picture, but you also really focus on the small picture, what happened in your family. And then I guess one question I would have is, how did that affect other people? Or and I know you're going to be hypothesizing here, but if some people in the family knew about it and kept it quiet, or how do people deal with that? Or were there concerns that maybe this is something that runs in the family? Is that bad, good, or indifferent?
Well, when you look at my family tree, and I think I mentioned to Tessa the other day about Dr. Peter Heinel, he does some great works with what he calls, I think he calls them genome, something to do with, anyway, it's your family tree. He works with people, he's a psychotherapist, he works with people via their family trees to identify patterns. And I know that my family is not unique, but when we looked at our family tree, first of all, I noticed that almost immediately after the incident, my grandmother and my grandfather got married. My one of my great uncles married his wife, and then later, within 6 months, three couples, three siblings of Alf had married their long-term partners. They got married almost immediately, almost as if they felt, we can't wait now, we've got to do this. It was very peculiar. And then I later found out that 2 of my great aunts ended their lives in mental hospitals, and one of my great aunts was a very ordinary woman, and she got a gambling problem. She lost her son and got a gambling problem that caused a huge amount of trouble in her side of the family and caused family ruin, in a sense. And we can then trace it down through the various branches and find out, yes, there's been a vulnerability to anxiety down through the generations, whether it's caused by that act, and you can't ever be certain. But I can't imagine that my grandmother, who actually seems to be the one member of the family who hasn't suffered with levels of depression and anxiety that required hospitalization. She was actually very sturdy and self-possessed. But her siblings fell apart, and they were all in the house when the suicide and murder happened. It happened in front of them. My great-grandmother was there, and somebody must have mopped the blood up. That's one of the things that I always think, is that my mum sat at the tea table and looked into the scullery where Alf killed Mary Street, his ex-girlfriend, and somebody must have cleaned it up, and it would almost certainly have been my grandmother and my great-grandmother and my grandmother. And 2 people cutting their throats, I can't imagine what it must have been like for them. Trauma, I mean, it's just extraordinary. And I found, as an aside, and why I always value the newspaper reports now, I found something completely by chance. His next-door neighbour, their next-door neighbour, had shell shock, and the sight of all the blood and trying to stop his children seeing what had happened next door sent him off into, well, it sent him off into the pub first, but then it sent him back into the trenches in his head, and he ended up putting a brick through the window of the police station because they kept throwing him out, and he thought it was a hospital and they weren't letting him in, and he got off with a very small fine and a lot of sympathy from the courts. but it was literally my great uncle's act that triggered his shell shock. So it resonated through the communities, and this was a kind of a lower middle class, my mother always called it, North London suburb. They'd worked their way out of poverty in the centre of London, and they were twitching lace curtain country, and I'm not surprised they hushed it up. It wasn't anything they were ever going to be very proud of. But to think that my grandmother, who I knew very well, had witnessed something like that is quite extraordinary, that they've managed to keep it quiet all that time. I did feel a little bit guilty, actually, but then I thought their stories needed to be told, rather than it's not fair to exhibit all this dirty laundry in public. I felt that the story needed to be told. So I found so many other stories like it that it seemed it was something that people might want to know more about.
And I think that if you hear these stories or if you read it, I think what happened to so many soldiers, and this has gone on in other wars since, because what was shell shock, was then combat stress, is PTSD, is, it goes by various names at various times, but you had said at the beginning, as far back as Greece, this is nothing new. Maybe the extent or how you treat it changes over time. But not telling those stories, not being aware of it, not knowing what to watch for and maybe how to help that person before they have an episode or before somebody snaps from the pressure like that next door neighbor did. All of these people who keep what happened bottled up inside, that has to have an effect on them, on their spouse, on their children, how they treat other people, how they deal with employees or an employer. And if we don't know about it, it makes it harder to understand. And I think a lot of us would rather not know about it, but it's one of those things that if you're going to engage in war, you have to be aware of not only physical ailment, but emotional ailment as well.
I think the shame was that after the First World War, because Brits being Brits, we had the 1922 Committee into Shell Shock, which was a landmark publication, went on for a long time and took a lot of witnesses, most of whom were government officials and officers. There were very few of the ordinary soldiers that had their evidence taken, but they came to the conclusions that, by the end of it, they had realised that anybody could break down. It wasn't just the conscripts, it wasn't the volunteers, it could happen to anybody, and that they did lay out a plan for future wars. But what happened was that, military psychiatry, which it would have been vital for them to have coordinated things and to carry on researching into shell shock, it didn't go anywhere. Certain treatments were taken into asylums and mental hospitals and practiced on often women. So, to that extent, there was a development in psychiatry. Modern psychiatry was benefiting, but military psychiatry, it all went very quiet. And then, of course, there was the Second World War. It happened again in different ways. But again, after the Second World War, military psychiatry didn't really pick up on it. And I think, I was saying to Tessa earlier that, it's not until Vietnam and the 80s and the obvious repercussions of the horrors that people were experiencing or had experienced, that PTSD and now combat stress became more recognised. Still, people who come back from Afghanistan find that the military authorities haven't liaised with, in Britain, the NHS, for example, so that there's no coordination between a man leaving the army with a history of mental fragility and the NHS that he's coming out to into the community. So even now, those men are breaking down. There's a great story. One of our Victoria Cross recipients from Iraq, he felt that he was always on battle alert. And even if a woman would crash into him in the supermarket with a trolley, he'd be feeling on battle alert the whole time. So it exhibits itself in aggression. And, I don't know in the States or in New Zealand, but there are suggestions that up to 10% of our prison population are veterans of recent wars. I think in the US they think it's higher because they do a lot more work in military psychiatry, I think, in the US. So there's a lot done here. It's just that we don't hear an awful lot about it, and that stigma about mental health is still out there. So there's, you know, these big men and women who have come back from, you know, being highly trained people with really long years of combat experience coming home to find themselves unable to cope in the community. It's still happening even 100 years on, which was partly why I wanted to write the book, because I thought if 100 years on we still don't get it right, why haven't we learned, even after 100 years, that you can't expect men and women to be in that kind of situation and come back into society and just adjust? And why should they, really? Why should they have to adjust? Society needs to adjust around them and include them, rather than make them feel like outsiders all the time, which is pretty much how many of them feel. So, of course,
I find that really interesting, because I had joined the military right around 1980, and it was in peacetime. But when I was thinking about what you were going to be talking about, I thought about it, and I remember the base psychologist at the time telling me he was, you know, the least worked person on the base, because there was just this rule, and I think it was the same whether it was a physical health problem or a mental health problem. That was like almost like I think culturally a sign of weakness, and people did not go for counseling. Nobody that I knew would go for counseling. So I think I really appreciate what you're saying, and I think it's not just a matter of legislation. There's a real cultural thing, and maybe more in the military, but in the broader society too. And I don't know, I think it's gotten better over the years, but I remember that vividly. Nobody would go for counseling. And in fact, I think that they felt it could influence their career opportunities. There were pilots who were worried it might affect their ability to fly, but you did not go for counseling.
No, and at the time, you see, we, even up to, I mean, people who I know who research the First World War said that up until the 80s, nobody was interested in the First World War. It was all the Second World War. It's only more recently, that these things have started to come back, not just because the centenary has been approaching, but because there are echoes. There's echoes through all these conflicts, and there's echoes down this century, and the boom in family history too. More and more people are interested to know the stories. They don't just want to know the dates and when they died and who they married. They want to know the social history, which is the important thing, you know, really flesh the stories out. So more people have wanted to know about that First World War experience. And certainly, I think we often, for many years, we talked about, oh, they didn't need counselling, our great grannies managed perfectly well. And I've got some great quotes, post-war quotes, going, you know, our Victorian grannies managed with these terrible things. Why can't we deal with it, all these neurotic people? You know, people genuinely thought that they could just keep it all in, and as long as they kept it all in, it would be fine. But then it would exhibit itself in alcoholism, exhibit itself in domestic violence, it would exhibit itself in brutality to their children, in ways, you know, men came back very changed, and they came back to a society that had changed. Women had started working, they'd got a little bit more independence, the children hadn't known them for 4 years. They came back to a world where they didn't really fit. Well, some of them felt like that. I'm always at pains to say many men enjoyed their experience and they felt it made them. But everybody will have been affected by it in some way. Even if they didn't come back shell-shocked, they would have come back affected in some way or another. And so, you know, there is this feeling like because they didn't talk about it, they were being somehow more brave. Actually, what they were doing was just storing up trouble for themselves in many cases. And really, there just weren't any words to describe it. I mean, now at least we've got a language, haven't we? We can talk about mental health issues with a language. But in those days, there wasn't a language. There weren't words. They didn't feel open. like you say, it would affect their employment, it would affect their relationships. People broke off engagements because they thought if they had children, if they'd suffered this, they would have children who'd be what they would call, these are their terms, imbeciles or defectives. And, the eugenics movement became very powerful after the First World War. Even doctors who'd witnessed these horrors felt that they shouldn't have children because somehow it would then transmit itself down the generations. So there was a sense even then, that the psychological impact of war was a very deep one, but yet they didn't do anything about it. They didn't find practical ways to make people feel able to express the horrors. It was best done down the pub with people that they'd been in a battalion with. They couldn't talk to their families about it. So it leads to millions of very sad stories, I'm sure. And I do tell a few in the book, people who remember grandfathers who were really quite brutal and fathers who were very remote. So I have got some.
And one of the helpful things, and Susie and I talked about this a little bit, is, it's good to be able to understand the history and not use your 21st century glasses on it. We need to go back and look at what it was like for them, and we might refer to somebody as being brutal or difficult or remote or whatever else, but have a little bit more understanding of where they were coming from, maybe what they experienced, and you get this out of some books, that you read, or the diaries from World War I, and is to not look at it with viewing it what they could do today, because for the most part the people who were serving, the conscripts as you're referring to them, came back afterwards and they needed to make a living. They were the poor, they were the middle class, but none of these people had the luxury of meditating on their experience or the rest of it, and you just kind of went on.
Yeah, they were working people and they found jobs.
And maybe the horror comes back to them 20 years later or 30 years later or whatever, or they just, as you said, put it someplace because they have to go on and just live. The family, the whatever else is depending on them. And so it's really a good thing. And I think one of the most interesting things about doing all of this World War I research is to kind of figure out where they were at, where their world was at. They didn't have the social media and certain of the other things that we have today where people shared information or were very open with it. You kept it to yourself.
Yeah, they didn't even have the radio a lot of the time. It's amazing when we can almost, we can't imagine a world without that kind of communication, but at the time, it's why there was, I know we're spending quite a lot of time on this, but there was a huge rise in spiritualism at the time, because people wanted, religion was not meeting their needs, and there was a real rise in spiritualism during and after the Great War. And spiritualism, I know that's something significant in the States. I don't know whether it's something that's got a history in New Zealand and Australia, but certainly we had, hundreds of thousands of people would go to spiritualist meetings and they'd try and contact their loved ones. And people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Oliver Lodge, who worked with Marconi on radio waves, they believed in these mediums, and they believed that they were able to contact. They both, Lodge and Conan Doyle, had both lost people in the war, and Lodge had lost Raymond, his son, and he wrote at great lengths. And why shouldn't he? Just the point you're making, Tessa. Why shouldn't he have believed it? He was working in the field of radio waves. For him, it was all new. The idea that we could transmit our voice across the Atlantic or from one end of the country to the other. Why shouldn't these women be able to tap into those waves and talk to the dead? It seemed quite logical to him, and people can sniff at it and say, why didn't he spot a fake when it was sitting in front of him? But for him, he wanted to believe, and many definitely tested some of these mediums, and they were never proved to be frauds. That's a very personal, opinion of whether you believe them or not. But certainly people really, really bought into the spiritualist church after the war, and I mean it subsided again by the 30s, but then had a little bit again of a renaissance after the second, because people just felt that there was no other way that they could communicate with their loved ones, but they genuinely believed that it was possible. So, you know, we can sniff at it now, but because we've got mobile phones and we know basically that we can talk to anybody anywhere at any time because we're doing it right this minute. You know, we can't afford to be sniffy about their response to grief and bereavement. I mean, it was a different world, but they would still have needed to respond. I mean, that's the point. They needed something. It was just a different something, and it was a different world, but they still needed to. And sometimes we've talked about these people as if they didn't need to, as if somehow they managed and we can't, and that mental health is just a symptom of a, I don't know, some kind of degraded society. But genuinely, these people just didn't have the words, and they didn't have the society that they could talk about this in.
They didn't have the words, and a lot of times they didn't have the interest at that point, because they were just trying. Everybody else seemed like they were fitting in, so you kind of want to, in a certain point, you kind of want to keep your head down. You know, most people who, when they first come back, or they can only talk about it with somebody that has also experienced it, because I don't know how you could tell somebody else about those horrors. One thing I want to do before we finish up today, because we've gone a little bit over, but this has been fascinating, is learn a little bit about your book. Comes out in, is it October, September, October?
Yes, comes out in October.
And it is called Shell-Shocked Britain?
Shell-Shocked Britain, yes. And it's published by Pen and Sword History.
Okay.
So I'm going to be, I'm on Twitter and I'm on Facebook. Shell-Shocked Britain's on Facebook and it's on Twitter. It's got its own Twitter feed.
Okay, great.
And so, yes, so I'm not here to plug it, but I am.
No, but the thing is, it's
enthusiastic about the subject. I'm sorry if I've gone off a bit at tangent. But, well, I did want to say quickly. Well, I did want to say quickly, because my book does use it, and it is really valuable because oral history has become more and more important for the First World War, and there have been historians in the last 10 or 20 years who have made an effort to take the testimonies of the veterans, the last veterans, obviously, who've passed now, and their families. But I'm always cautious with those. There's some wonderful books out there, but just like you've been saying, Tessa, those people were talking in the 80s, the 90s, and they were looking at their experiences through the prism of the century and also through the prism of another war. They had another war in between the First World War and when they were talking to these oral historians. So you're right, you are looking at things through the lens of the time that you're living in, but I still would always maintain that the responses are as similar and as valuable as, you know, the ones that we would have today. If they had, many were very interested, incredibly interested in those symptoms of shell-shocked, and it would have been really interesting to have lived through those years and see exactly, you know, what kind of influences were taking place.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast, but before I do, I want to remind people that if you go to the event page and you have any questions or you want to discuss this matter, you know, if you have questions for Susie, I will make sure that she gets them. And then we can also continue the discussion on the forum at the Society's website. And be sure to take a look at the prompts that Alex has religiously put up, because they take you in a lot of different directions, and it gives you a lot of different things to think about. The war affected people in a lot of different ways, and there's just so much there. And what I really want to encourage people is this is not just 1 year long type of thing. You know, if you start looking into this, this isn't something you're going to finish in a few moments, a few weeks, or you know, even in that year. But it's started. Yeah. When did you start your book?
Started. The war's not started yet, and we've already had 4 months, 5 months of
right.
Yes,
and I think it's going to go on for a while.
Yeah.
So on that note, I'm going to end the broadcast, but everyone can stay in the room who's here. And if you have questions, feel free to send them to us. And thank you very much, Alex, for getting this wonderful guest for us. And thank you, Susie, for joining us. It was
So
really
sorry
a good
to
hour.
be so inept.
And we will share that presentation with you. All righty.